What's up, you guys? Welcome back to my channel. My name is Danielle Hallen, and I am back with another true crime video. If you would rather listen to this in podcast form, don't forget that I do have that. You can go and look up Crime Bit with Danielle Hallen anywhere that you personally like to enjoy your podcast, and I will be there as well as all of my content. So don't forget that's a thing. I'm really, really bad at self-promotion, so figured I would sprinkle that information in here today now that I'm remembering to do that. But with that out of the way, let's go ahead and jump into today's case. Now, I feel like if you've been involved in true crime long enough, you kind of know how things go. There's just some disappearances that, for whatever reason, gain national headlines. There's major investigative specials, round-the-clock media coverage. It's like everyone possible knows these cases. But the story we're talking about today, Shane Fell's disappearance, didn't get any of that. And that is exactly why it needs to be told. This is a case with very few details. There were no dramatic press conferences, no viral campaigns, no swarm of reporters outside of police departments demanding answers. Shane's disappearance, from what I could tell online, barely made local news. There were just a few scattered reports, and there was brief coverage here and there. There's almost nothing about this case circulating on social media, and to see that is so incredibly devastating. And I know I can tell you guys these cases and you will share them across your social media, and that is what could make all the difference for this case, because behind all of the silence is a family that's been waiting nearly 14 years for answers, a mother that is still hoping to bring her son home, a brother who has replayed the same night probably over and over again looking for answers, because ultimately no one knows what happened to Shane Fell. He was on the phone with his brother after a late night car accident. He said he was okay and help was on the way, but within minutes, before anyone was able to reach him, Shane was gone. And while Shane's story is unique, I'm sure all of you already recognize that it seems to fit into this pattern that we see far too often. Typically young or middle-aged men last seen leaving a bar, their cars later found on the side of the road near water, and somehow, despite technology and searches and families that are desperate for answers, there's nothing. No evidence, no surveillance footage, no trail to follow, just absence. This case may not be as widely known, but that doesn't make it any less important, and that is a message that I want my channel to spread as far and wide as possible. So please hang around, listen to his story, and let's help get answers for his family. Shane Michael Fell was born on October 9th, 1974, and he was the oldest of two sons. And from a very young age, he stood out as someone with both curiosity and a lot of talent. His mom has described him as being creative, he was quiet, and he was always capable of entertaining himself for hours on end because he was always wanting to learn something. He was always building. One of his first hobbies was origami, and his mom said that he quickly developed a real knack for it. He could turn ordinary scraps of paper into these beautifully intricate designs. It takes skill and patience and precision, and Shane had that in abundance. He also developed a really strong interest in technology pretty early on, and while he didn't study computers formally in school, he ended up teaching himself everything that he knew. He was the kind of guy that would take things apart just to see how they worked and then put it back together even better. And this curiosity of his and this hobby of his that he had developed really seemed to pay off, because at the time of his disappearance, he was working for Verifone, and his role was basically writing and editing technical manuals. So it was really detailed, methodical work, and Shane was really, really good at it. Along with being so smart and creative, Shane was very gentle. He was soft-spoken. He had this kind of steady energy. He wasn't one to overreact or panic. He kept a level head at all times, and that is honestly like the kind of people that I admire the most. I will sit there and just analyze them forever. Like, how do you stay so calm? Because I'm on like level 100 all of the time. But that's just how Shane was. He took everything in stride. And more than anything else, he loved his family. Shane's bond with his younger brother, Brett, was particularly strong. It was just the two of them, and they stayed close even when Shane ended up moving to Savannah, Georgia for several years. Shane was also really close with his nieces and nephews, and he was actively involved in their lives. It was someone that they could count on and look forward to seeing. He didn't have kids of his own, but he did play a huge role in his extended family's life. Now, at some point in 2010, a long-term relationship that he had been in came to an end, and this breakup kind of prompted him to move back to Louisiana. That is where he had been born and raised, and then he moved to Savannah, Georgia for a couple of years, and he was ready to really kind of get back to his roots. He was excited to be close to his family again. And when he first returned, it was almost the ideal living situation. He moved in with his brother Brett and his family, who had just bought a rental property, and so he was living with them while the property was renovated, and then he was eventually able to move in and make it his home. He was close to everyone that he loved, and the job that he had with Verifone at the time was remote, so he was able to kind of spend his time how he liked it, quiet, to himself, doing his own thing, figuring things out, writing, exploring, being creative. Everything was going great for him. Now, Shane by no means was necessarily considered a social butterfly. He was more content to keep to himself. He had his routines that he enjoyed, and he loved spending time with family. And every week they actually had a family night that rotated between households. And more recently, like right up before his disappearance, Shane had started hosting these nights himself because he hadn't quite been back in town for about a year. He was trying to settle into his new home. So him taking the step of having everyone over to his house, he was so excited to cook for everyone. It really showed just how comfortable and happy he had become. He had structure, he had purpose, and more than anything, he had the people who loved him surrounding him. And that's what makes what happened next, honestly, so incredibly devastating. June 9th, 2011 was a Thursday. It was a warm summer night in Marrero, Louisiana, and Shane had made plans to meet up with his brother Brett and Brett's brother-in-law Josh at a bar called Rum Runners. And this wasn't just like a casual outing, it was a weekly tradition for them because Brett and Josh were a part of a pool team, and every week they would play together as part of this league. And on this particular night, it was especially important because they were having a competition. And from the way Shane's moms explained it, like, I guess if you wanted this competition, you went to one other big one and then eventually ended up in like one of the big ones in Las Vegas. Like, they took their pool very, very seriously. And so this was an important night for everyone. And so Shane went with them weekly. It's not really clear if he himself played or if he just went there to be a part. But regardless, this was something that the three of them always looked forward to. Now, they were there for several hours, at least 5, and they were drinking, but according to everyone involved, it was not an out of control kind of night. Like, the focus was this competition. Everyone had to be on the top of their game. Everyone had to be focused. Everyone wanted to win. And so people were casually sipping on beers and cocktails, but it wasn't anything extreme. And no one recalled Shane in particular being visibly intoxicated, but still, he had a few drinks. Now, all three men ended up leaving in separate cars at the end of the night at around 12:30 a.m. And Shane ended up leaving first and headed off in the opposite direction from the others. And thankfully, I'm so happy to see it, Shane and Brett had a long-standing habit. After nights out, they would always text each other to confirm that the other got home safely. This was just another part of their routine. It was a simple check-in that brought both of them peace of mind and something that I think everyone should do. And that night, about 10 minutes after leaving the bar, Brett hadn't received Shane's usual message, and Shane lived within just a few miles of the bar, so he definitely should have been home already, and so Brett was getting a little worried. So concerned and still driving home himself, at around 12:40 a.m., Brett decided to call Shane and make sure everything was okay. And he was relieved to hear Shane's voice on the other end of the line, but the words that followed were jarring. Shane said that he had crashed his car and flipped it into a ditch. But he explained to his brother that he had managed to crawl out through the driver's side window. He reassured him that he wasn't hurt and he was going to try to find a way home. But Brett immediately heard this and was like, no, do not try to find a way home. Like, don't move. He said he was going to get his wife and they were going to come there to pick him up and help him figure out the situation. Now, just a few minutes after this phone call at 12:40, Shane called Brett again just to confirm that help was on the way. And according to Brett, he seemed shaken, but he was still alert, aware of what happened and where exactly he was. It's what happens next that has just baffled everyone. Brett and his wife ended up arriving about 20 minutes later. So at 1 a.m., they had just spoken to Shane, like, what, 20, maybe 15 minutes earlier, and they were fully expecting to find Shane standing there near his car, maybe rattled with a few bumps and bruises, but still there. And instead, they pulled up to flashing emergency lights, which again is fine. First responders were already on the scene. The security guard that worked at some industrial businesses and lots had driven by, seen the car in a ditch, and decided to call 911. Shane's Saturn that he drove was still there. It was flipped up on its passenger's side, but Shane was nowhere to be found. He wasn't by his car, he wasn't in his car, he wasn't down the road, he was nowhere in the immediate area that anyone could find him. Somehow, in that short period of time between his last call and their arrival, less than 20 minutes, Shane had vanished. And that's not even really narrowing the timeline down to probably what it really is, because according to the guy that called 911, Shane wasn't there when he called. So we're possibly talking like 10 minutes, maybe even less, that Shane was there and then all of a sudden he was completely gone. Now, what is important to note here is that the route that Shane ended up taking home that night after leaving Rum Runners was not his typical drive home. Usually, he would have left Rum Runners, which is on Barataria, and he would have gone straight down Barataria and turned onto 4th Street, which is a well-lit, familiar road through residential neighborhoods, and his home was just a few miles away. But instead, he ended up on River Road. That is where the accident occurred, and this is way out of the way. On one side is a levee and the river, and on the other is just all these scatters of industrial equipment. And so it's not really the kind of road that you want to end up on if you're unfamiliar with it, especially not after midnight, because you've got the dangers of all the industrial equipment, you've got the dangers of the Mississippi River. This detail has specifically been noted by Shane's mother, the fact that he went on a completely different route than he normally would, because it's important to understand potentially the broader context of the case and what his actions may have been. Trying to understand his mindset is really the only way to gather what may have happened, because the biggest question at this point is, why did he go the opposite direction of his home and end up on this road in this area where he ultimately flipped his car? His family believes they have an idea of why Shane did this. Now, Shane may have been purposefully avoiding a police checkpoint that was sometimes set up on his regular route, right there at the intersection of Barataria and 4th Street. And it's not that Shane was heavily intoxicated. We know that he was having a few drinks that night, but there's no indication he was like absolutely wasted. But even having a couple of drinks obviously can be enough to push someone over the legal limit and result in a DUI. They believe that the fear of being pulled over and getting in trouble might have prompted Shane to avoid his usual route. But River Road is not a simple drive. It's a narrow 2-lane road with very little shoulder space. There's not much in terms of lighting. And there's one spot in particular where it creates kind of like an optical illusion. And it's caused by these industrial pipes that go over the road and the fencing that lines the road. It causes drivers that are unfamiliar with the area to misjudge a sharp turn. It looks like the road is going to continue straight, when instead it curves pretty hard. And it's believed that this is exactly what happened to Shane. Now, when Brett and his wife realized that Shane was missing, panic obviously set in immediately, and they stayed there on the levee through the early morning hours, calling out for Shane, searching the area, hoping that he had just wandered off and was nearby. And they weren't alone in that thought at all, because first responders on scene were equally confused, because there had been no reports of someone matching Shane's description walking along the road. There was no obvious trail to follow, just an empty car and silence. He would have had to walk through some sort of business area on main roads through neighborhoods to get away from this area, or he would have had to go into the river, which we will obviously get into. Now, to dive a little bit deeper into the 911 call. So according to this security guard, he was doing his rounds, and because these industrial lots stretch for so long, he actually has to get in his truck and like drive from one to another just to check and make sure. And he's not like inside the industrial areas, he's actually outside. And if you look, there's the industrial areas, a fence, River Road, which Shane was driving on, part of the levee that goes up up, and then there's another road that's like a service road, and that's apparently what he was driving on. And he noticed Shane's car over on its side and pulled over to investigate. And I don't think at first he knew if anyone was inside the car or not when he originally called 911, but he stayed there up until the point that first responders arrived, and no one ever got in or out of the car or called for help. On top of that, he said that he thought he saw the windshield wipers going when he found the car, which made no sense to anyone because the keys were never recovered anywhere on the scene. And so there's no way that they could have been on. I don't know if this was just a misunderstanding or, they just thought they saw something that they didn't. Again, it was really dark. It was not well lit, but regardless, Shane was nowhere to be found. When they looked closer at the car itself, they found that the airbags actually hadn't deployed, which wasn't entirely unexpected because according to Shane's mom, the airbag had been previously deflated like before he purchased the Saturn used. And when he realized it was broken, fixing it was kind of an expense he couldn't afford at the time, so he decided to just leave it be. And so the absence of an operational airbag only deepened concerns because if Shane hit his head during the crash, the lack of cushioning would have made the impact so much worse. And so this suggested that maybe he could have suffered a head injury that affected his ability to think clearly or respond rationally in the minutes that followed the accident. And another curious but very alarming observation was that the seatbelt also seemed to still be latched, like it was still clipped in place. And this led investigators to speculate that Shane may not have been wearing it and instead had been sitting on it. And I know a lot of people do that to silence like the seatbelt warning chime that's annoying and never stops, but it's annoying and it never stops for a reason, and it's to keep you safe. But his mom said he always wore his seatbelt, so that seemed kind of weird to her. But what was missing from the car was more troubling than what was left behind. So as I already said, the keys were gone. So he obviously had taken the keys out and gotten out of the car. Shane's wallet was gone, and obviously most importantly, Shane himself. Now, EMTs on scene, given all of these things that were found, raised huge concerns that Shane, like I said, could have suffered a head injury. And even though he had sounded alert and coherent on the phone, they warned his family that sometimes head trauma does not show symptoms right away. We actually spoke about this in depth on my Noah Pressgrove video where he got into that ATV accident and everyone said he was fine. Sometimes head injuries can just be funny like that. Someone can hurt themselves, everything seems cool, you don't feel like you have to be worried about them, but then these injuries settle in later on and things can go downhill really, really quickly. And so they worried that that's exactly what happened, that he walked off in a daze, disoriented, without realizing that he was in danger. And so this possibility shifted the urgency. If Shane was injured and wandering, which is dangerous on its own, but beside the Mississippi River, this was a critical situation. Police, however, didn't seem to treat the situation with the same level of seriousness or concern. Now, this is just from what I have gathered, so take this with a grain of salt. Unfortunately, I haven't seen press conferences or many statements by the police themselves. It's just been a whole lot of nothing. But from what I have gathered, it doesn't appear that they made any sort of push to report Shane as missing that night, nor did they really initiate a full-scale search. So I don't know, it just doesn't sit right with me. I don't know how you would pull up to the scene of an accident where the person that was driving the vehicle is gone. Their loved ones are there saying that they should be there. I mean, I just think it's crazy that nothing was immediately done by law enforcement, but it's probably because from the outset, their working theory seemed to be that Shane had been drinking and chose to flee the scene to avoid getting in trouble. And here's the thing, no one's denying that that might be a possibility, but it doesn't make his disappearance any less urgent, especially given the very real chance that he could have been injured and alone near the Mississippi River. And so their initial response, or really lack thereof, frustrated Shane's loved ones and left them alone, and it felt like precious time ended up being lost. And so as I said, Brett and his wife ended up staying at the site all night long until daylight searching for him. They had been trying to call Shane's phone repeatedly, but there was no answer. And this detail in particular haunted them because they had just spoken to him. And if Shane had seen the security guard or the lights from the first responders and been like, oh crap, I have to get out of here, and ran out of fear, why didn't he call once the dust had settled? Why didn't he let them know where he was and that he was fine? And so at around 5 a.m., after hours of searching with no results, they called Shane's parents and told them what had happened. Now, the entire family quickly gathered and returned to the crash site together because the car was still there. It had not yet been taken in by police, and they were out there all on their own trying to find any sign of Shane. Now, eventually, the car was taken in for examination, and his parents filed a formal missing persons report. But even then, it doesn't necessarily seem like the search officially expanded or that much was done. Shane's phone continued to ring for about a day and a half after his disappearance. It didn't go straight to voicemail, which meant that it was still powered on, but he never ever answered it. And so this strange kind of in-between status ended up raising more questions than it answered. The proximity to the Mississippi River sparked a very real fear that he might have gone into the water. I mean, how many cases have you heard of where there has been a young man leaving from a bar, ends up in a car accident beside a body of water, and ends up in the water? But because Shane's phone was still active, everyone had hope. Maybe he hadn't gone into the river. Maybe he really was just wandering out there somewhere, still alive, still reachable, and they just had to find him. Because when you have a phone with all of its different electrical components, especially something like a flip phone where there is like zero water resistance even to it, when you put that into water, that thing is absolutely going to short and die. Like, it's not going to be okay. Now, a few days into the search, pretty much the only clue they would ever find emerged, and it was one of Shane's shoes. He had been wearing a pair of dress shoes that night, and it was found stuck in the mud not too far from where the car was crashed. It wasn't like buried or torn, but it was enough to suggest that he had in fact been there on foot. And from the way it's described, it almost seems like as he had been trying to maybe leave the scene, his foot got stuck in mud and it pulled his shoe off. And so the question at this point became, how far could he have gone with one shoe on, one shoe off in the dark within that short window of time? And for me personally, it makes me wonder more about the state of mind that he may have been in, because most people would probably be extremely uncomfortable walking with only one shoe. It's not something that you just casually do. And so it makes me wonder, was he running off in a state of panic, or does this further indicate that his mind wasn't in a normal clear-headed state? Now, the surrounding area was quickly searched by ground and air. There were helicopters that were flown over using infrared, but what I find really frustrating is that it's not really clear how much of that effort was coordinated by law enforcement, because thanks to the Unfound podcast that interviewed Shane's mother, it made it sound like they were really the ones behind most of the search efforts. There was a flatboat that was brought out by family friends that scanned the banks of the river. There was another friend that had access to a private plane, and they conducted an aerial search with more infrared. Most of these early search efforts to locate Shane seemed to be by loved ones, family, friends, not necessarily authorities, and yet despite all of it, there was nothing. Because he obviously left on foot, his family also pushed really hard to have dogs out there. And I've seen his uncle, I believe it is, post a couple of times on a Web Sleuths thread about how they tried to get dogs out there, and they were kind of given a little bit of pushback, it seems, from authorities. I cannot confirm that, but that's just kind of what I was getting from the different comments that he made. So it took a while, a couple of days, for scent dogs to actually be brought in. But at that point, the conditions were not ideal. You have a small window to get the most accurate track possible, and it seems that they missed it. By the time the dogs got there, it was a few days after the accident. The grass had been recently cut, it had just rained, and the area had been heavily disturbed by searchers trying to find any sign of Shane. And so the dogs just seemed to be more confused than anything. But still, one dog did seem to pick up something. And I don't know if it's confirmed that they think this is the way that Shane may have gone, or if maybe this was just a fluke because of all of the disturbances. One of the dogs seemed to track a scent up the levee, down toward the river, which I'm sure put a knot in everyone's stomach. But then it turned, goes back up the levee, and stops at the road before seemingly losing the trail. And so if that is an accurate trail, that means that Shane may have gone toward the river, realized that I don't need to be over here, went back the other direction toward the road. But the fact that it stops could mean several things. The scent could have simply been washed away, or maybe it indicates Shane could have gotten into the car with someone. But there were no solid answers. All of this searching, all of these efforts should have led to something, a trace, a clue, but there was still nothing at all that explained where Shane went or why he left the crash site at all. And to make matters worse, there were already issues between Shane's family and authorities right off the bat. Their first interaction with his family kind of set this really messed up tone, because when an officer came to speak to Shane's parents the day that they reported him as missing, instead of focusing on finding Shane, he allegedly accused them of hiding him. They were told to turn him in, as if this were like a matter of willful evasion instead of a missing persons case, and that suspicion even extended to Shane's brother Brett, who was also accused of helping Shane avoid responsibility. Shane's family was devastated. Not only were they frantically trying to find someone that they love, but they were being treated like suspects and like they had done something wrong in the process. But unfortunately, this also made it painfully clear that assumptions had been made too quickly, and that cost valuable time. So after the initial search turned up nothing, the focus ended up shifting to gathering any surveillance footage that might help piece together Shane's last known movements. So Shane's family and potentially authorities, I'm honestly not really sure, went door to door, visiting nearby businesses along River Road to ask if any cameras might have captured something useful, because we all know those cameras are written over very quickly. So if you don't get to them immediately, you could lose the one thing that solves the case. And so his family was like, we are not missing out on this opportunity. And so according to what's been shared by Shane's mom, law enforcement did end up following up on some of the leads, and they managed to secure surveillance footage from a nearby facility. And this footage had the potential to be critical. It could show whether Shane walked away from the scene on foot, in which direction, if he got into another vehicle, if someone else was present. Even just identifying people in that area at the time could help piece together a more accurate timeline and potentially lead to new witnesses who may not have realized they saw something important, which is exactly what ended up happening. This footage led to an early breakthrough. There was a couple captured driving down the road, River Road, in the direction of Shane's accident at the exact same time of the crash, like within just a few minutes of it. So authorities were able to look at the license plate and track this couple down and brought them in for questioning. And this again just goes to show you that there are always people out there that usually don't know the kind of information they're sitting on, because they had no idea that this man that they spoke to ended up going missing within minutes of speaking to him. The couple told authorities that they had been driving down River Road and they saw Shane, or I guess who they believed was Shane at this point, standing beside the accident. And so they stopped to ask him if he was okay. They asked him if he needed any help. But according to them, Shane declined assistance. He said that he was completely fine, that he wasn't hurt, and that his brother would be there soon. And so they kept double checking, triple checking with him, like, are you sure you don't want us to take you to the hospital or call 911 for you? But he was like, no, like everything will be fine. You don't need to worry. He's literally only a few minutes away. And so after being reassured by Shane several times, this couple left, assuming everything was under control. And according to them, Shane didn't seem to appear injured or disoriented. He was as calm as he could be given the circumstances, and he was aware, he was coherent. Now, the police had contacted this couple and asked them to come in for an interview to give like a formal statement about what they saw. And according to Shane's mom, they had happily agreed, thinking that they were going to maybe help clarify the timeline and contribute something useful. They wanted to be as helpful as they could, but instead of a simple conversation like they thought it would be, it allegedly turned into something far more upsetting. According to what Shane's mom has been told, for reasons unknown, this casual questioning of this couple turned into a very accusatory conversation. The couple left the station visibly shaken and upset. They were accused of being involved. And of course, when you are the last to see someone who disappears, you are key to an investigation. But that doesn't automatically mean that you were involved in whatever happened. And from what I am understanding, they were forthcoming. They didn't come forward because they thought Shane was fine. They didn't know he ended up going missing. They thought it was just something random that happened and had no clue that afterwards all hell broke loose. And it was apparently so bad that this couple said that they would never step forward to help anyone ever again in a situation like this. And that is not the kind of thing that you want to hear, because we all need to be here to support each other and to help each other. That is so disheartening and unfortunately pretty consistent with how the investigation had been unfolding from the start. And it really highlights what so many people feel has been one of the core issues in Shane's case. This kind of like reactive approach, more focused on pointing out guilt than actively seeking answers. There was this knee-jerk reaction from authorities at what they believed was happening without knowing all of the details, and instead of trying to like ask questions and figure it out, there are immediate accusations being thrown, and unfortunately it has led to so many people not wanting to help anymore. This couple doesn't want to talk anymore. The man that called 911, the security guard, he apparently also won't speak to authorities because they came with all sorts of negative energy to his job so many times that he was worried he was going to get fired because of it. And so he no longer would speak to authorities either. Now, in speaking to this couple and also the man that called 911, another detail that is worth noting is that there had been a PT Cruiser at the scene as well. I guess when the security guard was standing there at the crash after he had called 911, a PT Cruiser drove by and offered to help, and the guard said, "I've already called, they're on their way, everything's fine." And so this PT Cruiser went off, and authorities reportedly worked to identify the car from surveillance, but nothing definitive has ever been shared publicly about if the driver was ever located or if they had any useful information. And while this does seem like a minor detail, what it says to me is that several vehicles were driving along the same road around the time of Shane's accident. We're talking in the span of 20 minutes, at least 4 cars, including Shane's, were on that road. And so the possibility that someone else could have seen something or picked him up is huge. And Shane's mother has said that the surveillance footage that police were able to obtain was extremely grainy, and so license plates couldn't be clearly made out. So while it did help place a few cars in the area like that couple, there's no way to know for sure if all of the cars had been identified or accounted for. And so that just leaves open the possibility that there were other passersby who were never traced and who might have witnessed something like that couple without ever realizing its importance. And because authorities didn't seem to put a lot of information out to the public, I mean, I don't know if there were other cars they tried to identify by putting a still shot out in the news like, "Hey, we saw this car in the vicinity of this accident. We need to know if you saw him walking on the side of the road, if you believe this is you." Like, I don't even know if any of that ever happened. So every single time, it's like they got close to bare minimum answers, like some sort of information that might help. It all was pulled out from underneath of them. Now, investigators at this point had conducted forensic testing on Shane's car, and inside, they were able to locate a small amount of blood and tissue on the driver's side door. And authorities believed that it was more consistent with something like a minor arm injury. So they believed it was possibly an injury sustained from Shane climbing out of the vehicle. And so that was all they really found in terms of blood and signs of injury. And so nothing in the car suggested he had suffered something life-threatening. There was no mass amount of blood. And apparently the car itself really wasn't heavily damaged. Those familiar with the scene said it just looked like one of the tires just perfectly clipped a small ditch and caused the vehicle to tip over on its passenger side. This wasn't a crash that involved Shane rolling multiple times or extensive structural damage. I don't even think that any of the windows were shattered. There was one shattered when everyone got there, but that was just from first responders trying to see if there was anyone in the car. Like, that is the minimal amount of damage that there was. It was like it tipped over and that was it. But without the airbag and without the seatbelt being in use, there was still a huge potential there had been a head injury. But even with this discovery, the case didn't seem to gain any traction. There were no significant updates in the weeks, months, years afterward. No large-scale public campaigns, no renewed search efforts announced by authorities. It felt like the case just kind of stalled, but Shane's family, they never stopped looking. They continued to organize their own search efforts, distribute flyers, and raise awareness wherever they could. At one point, they held a candlelight vigil for Shane, a gathering that brought together not just his loved ones, his friends, his family, but hundreds of strangers who came to show support. It was a moving tribute and also a reminder that even when that official momentum fades, a family's hope does not. And thankfully, they weren't totally alone, because eventually volunteer organizations started to step in to assist. And one of the largest ones was Texas EquiSearch. And as someone who personally is like Tim Miller's biggest admirer. I think it is incredible what he does, the work that his group has done over the years, his dedication. And I'm always so interested to see what Tim Miller's opinion is by the end of these searches, because he usually has such great insight onto what he believes happened, what he's found. He is a no frills kind of person. Like, he tells you exactly how it is. And I really appreciate that about him. But even he admitted to being deeply puzzled by the circumstances of Shane's case. It seems that at this point, he too was focusing very heavily on the Mississippi River. Again, you cannot ignore that's a huge possibility. But he has personally said that after all of the searches they conducted, in his opinion, he's not convinced Shane went into the water, which to me says a lot. If there had been even the smallest sign that Shane went close to that river, Tim Miller and his team would have found it. And unfortunately, because no more was found, no evidence literally at all to suggest even the direction Shane went, Texas EquiSearch left, and again, it was just Shane's family. And as the days turned into weeks, the silence only grew louder. Shane's phone, that had continued to ring, like I said, for over a day after the crash, it did eventually die. And so that lifeline, this one thread of hope, was gone. Authorities did end up informing Shane's family that because he had used this prepaid track phone, it was like an old flip phone, they weren't able to ping it for location data. And so this severely limited their ability to track his movements after the crash. Now, I feel weird about that. And on the Unfound podcast, they even spoke about that being a little odd. I always thought that, pinging it just had everything to do with the phone bouncing off the tower. Like, there is that interaction there. And if it's a phone, no matter what kind, that interaction is still going to exist. And so I'm not quite understanding how that can't be tracked. So if you have any knowledge on that, please let me know down below, because to me, it seems a little bit weird, but it could very well be the truth. Additionally, there was never any more activity on Shane's bank accounts, on his credit cards. There was no digital footprint, just another indication that he hadn't used any resources at all or made any contact in the days following his disappearance. Friends of his back in Georgia all kind of got together and hired a PI, but unfortunately, this didn't seem to find anything else at all. I mean, it's just one of those cases where you need something more. There needs to be more evidence. There needs to be more to work off of than they have in order to proceed any further. And everyone, no matter their intentions, that seems to be working on this case can only make it so far before they hit a wall, and there's just nothing more they can do, which in my opinion is why awareness for this case is going to be everything, which is why I'm so sad that it has not received more, because there could be people out there that have information that don't know that they have it.
But it comes with me wherever I go.
It's hard to believe a wallet-sized photo could mean so much to a person, but for Shane's mom, Terry, it's her source of strength.
That's how I get through.
2 years now after the day she'll never forget, June 10th, 2011. Shane was heading home after playing pool with some friends and his brother Brett when he crashed his car at this curve on River Road. He called his brother Brett and told him what happened. By the time Brett and first responders arrived, the car was there, but Shane was not.
He's just lost. We just feel like when the car rolled, he hit his head. He doesn't remember who he is or where he is.
Friends and family gathered at the accident scene on Sunday. While most people release balloons to loved ones who have passed, these balloons were not intended that way. These balloons were beacons.
Yellow means, please come home.
The Lord is my shepherd.
And after a short prayer, those beacons were let loose.
1, 2, 3. Come home, man.
My little boy is still out there, so, we're just continuously look. There'll never be a day that I've breath in my body. Never a day will go by that we won't continue to look for him.
Now, this is officially a cold case now. The family says it hasn't got much in terms of tips in the last year, but it isn't giving up hope yet. Rachel?
You never know. Someone might know something who's watching this.
Now, more than a decade later, Shane's disappearance still remained one of the most baffling missing persons cases in Louisiana. There had still been no confirmed sightings, no digital trail, no evidence of foul play. It feels like he simply vanished into thin air. Seeing Shane's uncle on the Web Sleuths thread just desperate for help and asking people if they knew how to get in touch with the morgue and, how to figure out all these different things, seeing them have to navigate this situation on their own First of all, without like a victim's advocate of any kind, without law enforcement seemingly constantly being there to help them, it has been heartbreaking to see it. And to imagine living like that for years is honestly unthinkable. Shane's family has seemingly carried the responsibility of locating him and figuring out what happened largely on their own. And it's something that they have done relentlessly. They've followed up on every rumor, they've knocked on doors, distributed flyers, returned to the crash site dozens of times. They've never stopped hoping that someone somewhere knows something. And honestly, even though not many know his case, just reading some of the forums and the Facebook page on their own, the people that do know about it are some of the most dedicated that I have ever seen. People that drive by this area several times. People are going and looking all around New Orleans and the surrounding areas at different homeless camps to see if maybe he wandered off there. There are so many people that are trying, but there needs to be so much more. Now, obviously, there are several theories that have circulated about what could have happened to Shane Fell that night, because since there's nothing solid, theories are really all anyone has to work off of, and there are a ton of them. And while none of them can be confirmed, I feel like they kind of reflect both the uncertainty surrounding his disappearance and the urgency of revisiting his case with fresh eyes. I think that is the most important thing that could happen at this point, is someone new looking into his case deeply. I'm not talking like briefly looking into it. I'm talking re-interview people, start from the beginning and work your way through. Now, one of the earliest and most persistent theories is that Shane, disoriented from the crash and potentially suffering a head injury, wandered away from the scene and fell into the Mississippi River. Now, the river was less than 100 yards from the crash site and obviously poses a very real danger. And obviously, searchers, authorities, they did take this possibility seriously. And the Mississippi River near the crash site was searched so extensively several times to the point where it had even been dragged. And to give you an idea of just how thorough the search was, they actually uncovered another body, someone completely unrelated to Shane's disappearance, while searching for him. And I think in the weeks after Shane's disappearance, there actually was a total of 2 bodies removed from the river in that stretch. And I wish I had been able to find more information about them, like when it's believed they may have gone into the river, to try to understand like the currents, because obviously that might help figure out where Shane may have gone if he had gone into the river. How far away could he possibly get? Or should he be in that area? Now, the level of search effort led a lot to believe that if Shane had gone into the water, it's unlikely that he would have left no trace. He would have shown up somewhere. I mean, when you find 2 other bodies in the search, you would assume you'd probably find Shane's if he was there. Others, however, argue that despite the thoroughness of the search, the Mississippi's strong currents and the unpredictable flow could have still swept him away quickly, making recovery nearly impossible. And water is just one of those things that you can never say for certain. There's so much debris in rivers like that. Again, the currents can change, water level changes everything. I mean, there's really no way to say for 100% certainty that someone did not go into the water just because you didn't find them. And that is like straight out of my nightmares. Another theory is that Shane may have been picked up by someone while walking along River Road. And according to the podcast interview on Unfound done with Shane's mom, at the time that podcast was done, that was her biggest belief. We know that several cars were on that stretch of road around the time of the crash. Honestly, more cars than I expected to be out there at that time of night. And so some speculate that someone with bad intentions may have offered him a ride and taken advantage of his vulnerable state. Unfortunately, crime in areas like this, theft, things along those lines are not unheard of at all. Or maybe it was innocent. Maybe he had no clue where to tell these people to drop him off, so he ended up who knows where. And maybe that person just hasn't connected the dots, realizing that they helped out a missing person, and so they've not come forward. And I feel like the one thing that really pushes me to think this is a possibility is just how fast he seemed to be able to get out of the area. There's really not many places to hide. And I know there's this belief that if Shane was scared, he might have run off somewhere to stay out of the sight of authorities, first responders, possibly even his family who was there. But you have the levee and like a dock and the water. Like, where exactly are you going to hide? But other than climbing a fence and going into one of these industrial areas and hiding behind equipments or in big pipes, there's not really anywhere to go where you wouldn't be seen. And so the quickest way to get out of the area would be to get in someone's car. And since the dogs tracked his scent seemingly to the road and then it stopped, I think think that's a huge possibility. And I also think it's a huge possibility that if word got out that authorities were accusing anyone and everyone who was even near the scene of potentially being involved, there might be someone out there that gave Shane a ride that is now horrified to come to police with that information because they're scared they're going to be accused of something. I mean, they've really just not set up a good and safe situation for anyone to feel comfortable coming forward and giving what information they might have. And so I hope if there is someone out there in that circumstance, you just need to come and tell someone. Now, there's also a theory that Shane may have simply panicked, like I kind of just briefly talked about. If he was worried enough that he went completely out of his way to potentially avoid a DUI checkpoint, it's pretty safe to say that he probably freaked out when he flipped his car and realized he was potentially still going to get in trouble. And that was honestly my very first gut feeling looking into this case. The fact that he was there one minute and gone the next, the fact that he was a little panicky on the phone, the second phone call that he made to his brother to make sure he was coming. I feel like he stood there and like those few minutes felt like years, and like the longer he was there, the more vulnerable he was, the more chance he was likely to get in trouble, that someone was going to see the car. Maybe after that first couple stopped, he worried that someone was going to call 911, and then maybe when he saw the security truck that may or may not have had lights on it, he freaked out and he ran. That was like my first gut feeling. And according to his mom, he had an incredibly clean record. Like he had never gotten in trouble before. And I feel like the people who have never been in trouble before, who have never had to face that, are usually the ones who get the most horrified about the idea of getting in trouble, because it's like this unknown and it's like this tarnish on your name. And so I feel like he might have seen that security guard or seen or heard sirens and he got out of there, or at least went to hide away from the car until his brother got there in case someone else drove by. But that doesn't explain why he didn't reach out later, why he didn't call anyone, why he didn't use his phone, his cards, or leave any other sign. And it's also worth noting that not only did he have no like criminal history, but he also had no history of fleeing from his problems. He was super responsible and grounded. He was not one to make like rash decisions. Now, obviously I can't verify this, but there was someone that commented on the Web Sleuths thread that said that they played Minecraft with him. And like he was the most chill, unreactive person they'd ever met. So in my opinion, I don't think he ran and then just stayed gone by choice. I feel like it might have started out that way, but something had to have happened after that. I don't think it was that in and of itself, and Shane just decided to disappear and never come back. Now, another theory that's been quietly discussed online is the possibility of foul play that wasn't immediately obvious at the scene. There are some posters on Reddit and Web Sleuths that have pointed out Shane's missing items, things like his key, his wallet, and one shoe, could suggest that he got into some sort of confrontation or robbery. But personally, I mean, there's no evidence really supporting that. No witness ever came forward to report suspicious activity in the area. And when they did search around the area, there was no sign of a struggle. And since there was enough mud for a shoe to get caught in, I feel like it would have been pretty apparent. And so I just don't think that's a very likely theory. And then there is the final theory that Shane experienced some kind of memory loss or confusion after the crash, something that I have touched on several times already throughout the video, and that maybe this caused him to wander off, forgetting who he was or where he was going. And some members of Shane's family, I think even his brother, seems to be on board with this theory. At least that's what was stated a while ago. Now, it seems to be wondered if he might have actually ended up back in Georgia, because apparently if he had his wallet with him at the time, his ID still listed Georgia on it. And so if someone had found him and looked through his wallet to try to help get him home, or if he was lost and confused himself and trying to figure things out, one look at his ID would have said, hey, you're supposed to be in this area of Georgia. That could have been the only location that made sense to him. A lot of the times when you have head injuries and things that involve memory loss, it kind of deletes most recent memory and takes you back to a while before. And that would have been the years that he was in Georgia. And while this sounds kind of far-fetched and unlikely, there have been several cases where someone has suffered a traumatic incident, become disoriented, and live for months or even years without any memory of their previous life. So they think it's possible that maybe he tried to figure out where he was supposed to be, what he was supposed to do, and somehow ended up back in Georgia, and that's made it that much harder to find him. But the problem with this is those people usually turn up somewhere. Eventually, they are found in a homeless encampment or end up in a hospital or something along those lines and can't properly be identified. But Shane has never showed up anywhere. In the end, we don't know which theory, if any, comes closest to the truth. But what we do know is that Shane didn't just vanish into nothing. And until the truth comes out, his family is going to continue living in this excruciating uncertainty. And that should not be how this is. His mother, his brother, his extended family, they all continue to advocate, to push for awareness, and to remind the world that Shane Fell is still missing. There already was such a lack of exposure in this case. And unfortunately, the more time passes, the less exposure there usually is. And that's the exact opposite of what this case needs. There hasn't been a single verified sighting since that night. There have been no updates from authorities that we know of, no new statements. They said they were quicker to believe he was abducted by aliens. That's how little there is on Shane's disappearance. And that's why it is so important to share Shane's story now, because time has passed, memories have faded, evidence disappears, and the longer this case sits unsolved, the harder it's going to become to untangle. And I cannot fathom living a life where I don't know what happened to my son. Like, that is not something I ever want to consider as a possibility, not just for myself, but for any other person. That is not fair. That is not right. They need to have answers. And so we can't give up. Shane Fell mattered, his life mattered, and his story still does. It's also a reminder of how important community action is, because in so many cases like Shane's, it's the families and it's the local communities who are keeping the hope alive. Without those shares, without those likes, without that attention, without those words of encouragement, these cases can disappear into the void. And I know that you guys will help me make sure that that does not happen. If you know anything, literally at all, please come forward. You can call the Jefferson Parish Sheriff's Office at 504-363-5500. Anonymous tips can also be made through Crime Stoppers. I'm just going to say that again in case there was someone that picked him up and is too horrified to go to the police about it. You can always say something anonymously. There's also a Facebook page dedicated to Shane, but I have not seen any recent activity on it at all, which also makes my heart just shatter. So please share his story as far and wide as you can. Share it to other creators. Shane was 36 years old, 5'11" and 190 pounds, brown hair and green eyes. And at the time of his disappearance, he was wearing a black shirt, jeans, and brown dress shoes. And again, one of his shoes was recovered, but the other and Shane are still missing. Don't just be a listener of true crime. Be an advocate. Be an active listener. You have so much power in your hands by just hitting like, by just hitting share, by printing out posters. You can change an entire case's trajectory. So with that being said, that's all that I have for you guys today. Thank you so much for taking the time out of your day to listen to Shane Fell's story. If you haven't already, go ahead and hit the subscribe button down below to become a part of the Helen fam so we can hopefully bring them home together or bring them justice together. And I will see you guys in my next video. Bye.